Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 12 of my Witchwood card review. This time around, I have 10 cards. A ton of cards are revealed, so we have a lot to get through. That said, if you don't have a ton of time, you can hit the link in the description to go check out my quick reviews, where I just run through each and every card really fast and rate them from 1 to 5 stars, so you can see the reveals, get my overall take. But if you have a little while, you want to talk through these cards, let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. Up first here we have Dollmaster Dorian, a new 5-mana 2/6 neutral legendary, and his effect reads, whenever you draw a minion, summon a 1/1 copy of it. It's pretty cool. He's a Dollmaster. He makes tiny little versions of your other minions. That's really cool thematically. Now, as far as the card is concerned, I'm not sure Dollmaster Dorian's quite so cool. I will admit that this is a pretty powerful effect, and anytime you have an effect that does something powerful, there's always a chance for the card to see play. There are some clear combo potentials for this sort of card. You know, cheating out a Malagos, for instance, could be quite powerful, and maybe even fairly consistent in a deck like Rogue, where you have things like Elven Minstrel, where you know you can draw specifically minions and put a limited number of minions in your deck. Still risky because you could always draw Malagos first, but there are potentials. Combos can exist, and it's not just Rogue, there are other classes as well. That was just the first one that came to mind. So I think this card could maybe find a home. There's somebody that could build a deck to support this perfectly, and it'd be pretty cool. I have seen other people comparing this more generally to something like Barnes as sort of a cheat out minion where you cheat out really big scary stuff before you're supposed to. I don't think that's a home for Dollmaster Dorian at all. That's not how this card's going to be utilized. The big difference being that Barnes is immediate on its battle cry. It's unconditional. It's very easy to achieve. You can put a select set of minions and know that it's going to happen when you play Barnes. That's not the case with Dollmaster Dorian because it is draw dependent. You have to play him, then you have to draw the minion. And that introduces so much extra RNG because you don't know what you're going to draw unless you have some sort of specific tutor. There have been some tutors added to the game, things that draw specific minions. Already mentioned Elven Minstrel. There's also the Divine Shield draw card for Paladin that can draw a specific Divine Shield, so you could maybe guarantee drawing yourself a Tyrion. Again, there's ways to work with this. It's kind of cool, but you have to build your deck very restrictively in order to empower it. I think a more general use case, if you're looking for a more general use case with something like Dollmaster Dorian, might just be in a deck that includes like a bunch of Death Rattles, for instance. You could slam this in like a Quest Death Rattle Priest, have a lot of different Death Rattles, even if it just gets you a Loot Hoarder. Hey, you're happy to have a little bonus and get a nice little extra minion, basically for free because you didn't have to spend any mana directly to put that into play. Of course, you had to spend some mana or resources to draw cards, but that's something you wanted to do anyway, probably. So Dorian adds a little bonus effect, essentially, to all of your card draw as long as he's on the board. So, for instance, a class like Warlock could get maybe extra use out of this because, of course, they have hero power, card draw bundled right in, and Dorian's much more consistent in that regard. The downside, of course, is running spells in your deck makes Dorian less consistent and potentially weaker, so that's an issue. It just depends on essentially the class, the perfect deck, the right sort of environment, really powerful turns. So I don't think Dollmaster Dorian's very consistent. He's not the sort of thing you just love to drop on turn 5. He's the sort of thing you have to work with and build around a little bit in order to support it. And then even if he does work outside of some really specific Malagos combo, like I mentioned, that wins you the game, he's probably just in a slightly above average turn most of the time. Yeah, if you get the Savannah Highmanes or the Obsidian Statues of the world, you're pretty happy about Dollmaster Dorian, I guess. That works. But I do think there are some consistency issues. So I think the card is fine. It's good. It certainly has the potential to be played. It's just not one of those perfect legendaries that is generally used across all decks, of course. It's going to have to be in slower decks or combo decks, and still something that's going to have to be fiddled with in order to make it work. So a limited potential, but certainly a lot of upside as well. So now let's talk about some Warlock cards. There are 3 Warlock cards I'm going to be reviewing here, and all of them follow a central theme, which is doing something when your hero is damaged. And in fact, the card right here, Blood Witch, is all about damaging your hero consistently at the beginning of each turn in which she's alive. So the idea being that Blood Witch, this 4-mana 3/6 at the start of your turn, deal 1 damage to your hero. If you play this card, you're going to have a way to damage yourself to empower the cards we're going to see in the future because their effects are conditional based on taking damage. And I'll just go ahead and spoil it right now. The 2 cards we're going to review next, the effects they provide just aren't strong enough. They aren't that like crazy or swingy or hugely impactful. So a card like Blood Witch so far looks like she's just going to lack the reason to run her. Because the only reason you'd want to damage yourself, of course, is to set up other stuff. And right now, it just doesn't look like that's going to make sense. Damaging yourself isn't worth the upside you can get from these other cards, because these other cards just aren't better than the kinds of things Warlock does now. So what you're left with is essentially a regularly statted 3/6 minion. Like, that's a Water Elemental stat line at 4 mana, and of course Water Elemental is great, but it has a lot of upside. This card by default just has downside. You don't want to take damage ultimately in Hearthstone, unless, again, you're getting some trade-off, you're getting some value pushed back, but you're just probably not going to be able to do that. And there are plenty of other self-damage cards in Warlock, and as you'll see from the upcoming cards as well, they don't even require you to take damage from a card like the Lesser Sapphire Spellstone does. They only require you to take damage in your turn. So even your hero power is going to empower these cards. So between things like Flame Imp and Kobold Librarian, Hellfire, your hero power, I don't think Blood Witch will become a necessary part of a self-damage Warlock deck if that were to become a thing. She's just not going to be strong enough to empower that. And since her stats aren't great for a 4-drop either, I don't really see a great reason to run her. I mean, frankly, I think they could have made this a 4/6 minion. They could have overstatted it just a little bit to make up for the fact that it has some downside. And that would have really helped the other cards that are all based on self-harm actually feel better, because the minor upsides they provide would be much more substantial if Blood Witch herself was pretty powerful too. But since this looks like a merely average or even below average card at a base level, it just doesn't seem like it's going to line up to support those other pieces. So now let's talk about the first of these other Warlock cards. This is the Dusk Bat, a new 3-mana 2/4 beast. And its battlecry reads, if your hero took damage this turn, summon 2 1/1 bats. So as you can see here, better than average 3-drop. This is basically the exact same as a 4-drop that's in the game now, a 2/4 that summons you 2 1/1s, but it gets a mana discount. It's only a 3 mana, so above average card. That, of course, makes up for the downside of having taken damage. Clearly, that's the idea. And this would be something you'd want to run probably in a more zoo style of play, more aggressive, more early board based, because clearly this isn't going to go very far in a controlled deck by any means. And it's a 3-mana card, which notably comes before our previous card here, the Blood Witch. So not something you could play after the Blood Witch consistently on curve in the early game. You'd often want to play this on its own on turn 3 or on turn 4 with another card that damages itself. Clearly, you could top deck this in late game scenarios as well, where you life tap into it and then it's automatically activated. That's fine for zoo support. But that, to me, the kind of curve issue is really the downside for Duskbat, is that most likely, if you wanted to play this on turn 3, it's not going to be active. It's really more like a 4 or 5 mana card that you combo with something else, or a card that comes down later in the game. Because if you wanted to play this with like a Flame Imp or a Kobold Librarian in a zoo deck, you need 4 mana to do that. And that's fine. Sometimes that would line up perfectly. You'd have that 1-drop to flex out with it, but other times you'd play your 1-drops early, they would damage you, and then you wouldn't have a self-damage option on turn 3. So then maybe you have to combo this with your hero power on turn 5, and this is just not that good on turn 5. Clearly, by that point, your opponent's going to have more ways to deal with it, more stats on board. These stats just don't go quite as far on turn 5. So the conditional aspect of this is challenging it quite a bit. It's comparable to something like Imp Gang Boss we saw in the past, was one of the most dominant, perfect zoo cards ever designed. Imp Gang Boss was wonderful. But again, this is not a 3-drop, really. It's kind of a weird flex 4, 5, 6 late game drop in some ways in Zoo. And so even though it's guaranteed to give you the bats, which Flame Imp never was, it's just not quite as good early in the game where Zoo really starts to thrive. So because of the issues with activating its effect, being a bit inconsistent from a mana standpoint, the fact that it comes before the curve in Blood Witch's case, which is like your setup card for these kinds of decks, because things like Hellfire and Lesser Sapphire Spellstone probably don't work well in Zoo decks, which are 2 of the other synergy cards for the self-damaging style of play. All of that means Duskbat looks pretty challenged. I mean, I think it's okay at a fundamental level, like the stats are there. If you got it to work on curve, you'd be super happy about it in a Zoo deck. but I don't see how that's going to be the case. It seems like there are too many puzzle pieces to put together, and the upside here is just not worth trying to make your deck support it. So to me, Duskbat is still going to fall a little bit short. So now let's move on to the third Warlock card here. This is the Deathweb Spider, a new 5-mana 4/6 beast. Its battlecry reads, if your hero took damage this turn, gain lifesteal. So at a base level, this is a 5-mana 4/6. Certainly nothing exciting there. That's a bad card. That would never be played. But if the effect goes off and you have taken some damage, then boom, you get lifesteal. And a 5-mana 4/6 lifesteal is arguably better, but I would argue still probably a little bit too weak. And I like the idea here, thematically speaking. Clearly, if you're taking damage intentionally from all these cards, like your Blood Witch and whatever else, your Flame Imps, and you're trying to play that style, then having some lifesteal would be handy because you heal all that damage back up. So this one sort of makes up for the sacrifice that you've taken earlier to empower all these earlier cards. But I just don't think lifesteal is good enough. We've seen it time and time again. Blood Queen Lanethel never made a lot of sense. This card is remarkably similar to Blood Queen Lanethel, a previous legendary, which ideally would have at least 4 attack when you played her. But frankly, lifesteal seems to only work in very specific instances where you either have a super defensive card, something like Obsidian Statue, for instance, that gets cheated out or it forces your opponent to attack into it. Or sometimes in the case like King's Bane, for instance, yeah, Lifesteal's good, or Lifesteal's good there because, of course, you are guaranteeing the attack. You know it's going to go off unless you get frozen, of course, or whatever. But when you just put it on a standard minion and you throw it out there, if it doesn't have taunt, it just never seems to go off. It doesn't seem to work. You've seen that 1,000 times probably with things like Zombeast, or at least I have. If you build a Lifesteal Zombeast and put it on the board, it never gets to attack. It never goes off. They either remove it or end the game because it's just sitting there so passively. And I think that's the challenge that Deathweb Spider is going to have too. I'm just not convinced that the lifesteal is worth it. If you play it into an aggro deck, they're probably just going to ignore it and hurt you for more than 4 damage on any given turn because they won't want to trade into it to heal you. So just ignore it and let you heal 4 back occasionally while they're hitting you for 10. If you play it against a control deck, they'll just have some removal tool for it if they're worried about the lifesteal aspect. So I don't think this fits as like a top-end curve in a self-damage zoo deck. There's nothing there. You'd rather just play Doomguard, I suspect, because it provides so much more pressure and onboard value than Deathweb Spider. And ultimately, you're willing to sacrifice health in Hearthstone, particularly in Warlock. It's okay. You don't necessarily need to get that health if you're going to win the game before the health matters. So a card like Deathweb Spider just doesn't seem to solve any problems for me. This one looks like it's going to come pretty far short, which is sad because if you look at all 3 of these cards in a bundle, right now they just don't do enough to make it worth it. There are already great ways to play Warlock, and these don't seem to contribute to those ways or be good enough or different enough to carve out their own sort of path. So as a package, I'm just not convinced here that this self-damage set is worth it at all. I think basically each of these fall short on their own, of course, but even when you bundle them together, they still don't really look all that good. So up next here, let's talk about Bogshaper, a new Shaman Minion. This is a 7-mana 4/8. And it's an elemental, and it reads, whenever you cast a spell, draw a minion from your deck. So this is sort of a Gadget Zan Auctioneer-esque Shaman Minion, where you turn spells into cards. And that's pretty cool, right? Card draw engines are exciting. The downside for Bogshaper, of course, is that it is a little bit more expensive at 7 mana instead of 6 for Gadget Zan Auctioneer, although it does have elemental synergies and health. 4 extra health over Auctioneer, so those are both huge upsides. That's pretty important, I think, for Shaman in particular. They like elementals, and the health gives it a lot of survivability. The one other downside, though, I would say with Bogshaper in some ways is that it can't draw you spells, so it never chains into itself like an Auctioneer would in Rogue. I think that's probably okay with Shaman because specifically I suspect this card is intended to be utilized with things like Unstable Evolution, where it's always chaining into additional spells, so you don't really need the additional spells off Bogshaper. You're just trying to refill your hand. And, hey, that's still a fairly powerful thing to do. In particular, this has some neat synergies with cards like Hagatha and Witch's Cauldron and even the Witch's Apprentice, all these new Shaman spell generation cards where even if you get a bunch of junk spells in your hand from all these generation cards, Bogshaper can basically turn them into minions. and then you can maybe play some minions to get more spells and so on and so forth. Like there's a nice little synergy and chain all building into some kind of deck idea, I guess. I don't know if that's a deck idea that'll work, but hey, it's a deck idea, so maybe Bogshaper will get some support there. So what I'm saying is essentially, if you look at this, it does cool things. It does good things. It does strong things. And any card that does something unique and powerful and specific and has decent stats for its cost is the kind of card that can be played. Now that said, I still think Bogshaper has some problems. It's really, really slow. The turn you play this, you're basically just passing to your opponent. You're not doing anything significant. Aggro deck, for instance, will just run you over because you didn't play a taunt. You didn't do anything defensive. So it's going to be difficult sometimes to find windows to play this guy. And then against a control deck, of course, they're probably going to have some single target remove it to deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean it's not playable. Of course, there are lots of different good minions, and your opponent has to space out the removal. It's just a challenge because it's not good necessarily in either environment. But if it does stick, it's a lot of value. And then there's other instances where even if it doesn't stick, even if you just play this on turn 10 with 3 unstable evolutions, it might be okay if you have another minion on board to unstable evolve, because you don't want to evolve your Bogshaper, because then you only get 1 minion drawn out of it, which could be problematic. Although you do get an 8-drop, which, hey, at the end of the day, 8-drops are pretty good on average, so maybe it wouldn't be that bad of a play. Create an 8-drop and draw a minion. Maybe it's worth it. The other question I have, I guess, for this card is, if you're drawing through your deck and drawing through a ton of minions, are you running out of cards too fast? What's your game plan? What's your play style? Is it like a mid-range deck that's looking to refill its hand? Is it a control deck that gets too full of cards or kills itself in fatigue? I don't know the answer to those questions just yet, so that's another challenge for Bogshaper. Basically, I'm saying, cool card, does something neat, might open up a playstyle, synergizes with Shaman, but from a mana standpoint, cost standpoint, speed standpoint, some really, really, really big challenges for Bogshaper to overcome. So now let's talk about a new hunter spell, Dire Frenzy. And this is the Dabbing Grizzly Bear, it looks like. This is a 4-mana spell that gives a beast +3/+3. So a bit like a weak Blessing of Kings on the top end. And then it also shuffles 3 copies into your deck that also gain +3/+3. And that's pretty crazy. It's Gang Up, but with a huge buff upside. Compared to Gang Up, this card just looks ridiculously better. Now, of course, Gang Up was really only ever played in like mill rogue decks that weren't super successful or high tier. But the stat buff here makes Dire Frenzy look so much better that I think it has some potential to see play. It does a cool thing. It's not as good as Blessing of Kings, and Blessing of Kings is not the best card ever. It gets played and constructed, though, so it's viable. The conditionality that it has to be a beast is a little bit of a downside with Dire Frenzy, because even though Hunter likes to run beasts, they don't necessarily run all beasts, so there might be some turns where this falls short and just doesn't do anything and becomes a dead card. That's a problem. Also, the challenge for this card for me is, what kind of deck runs it? What do you want your deck to be? Because essentially shuffling those copies into your deck is a long-term value plan. Like, yes, they have extra stats. Yes, you're getting +9/+9 into your deck, and that's pretty good because you could get some really scary stuff out of there. But that means you're playing for the long game, because Hunter is not known for card draw, and they're usually not known for not drawing through their deck. They run out of stuff, and the game either ends or they lose, one of the two things. So this has to go in a slower Hunter deck that expects to draw into that stuff, that expects to have the time to find those minions again, or maybe suss them out of their deck with something like tracking, perhaps, is another way to do it. So you have to support it via deck building in some ways and curve in some ways. Otherwise, Dire Frenzy would just fall really short because it's a bad Blessing of Kings on board, and you're putting the value into your deck and you're never seeing it again if you're in a face deck. So it has to be the right kind of deck to support this, and that's fine. Those decks can exist. Somebody can figure that out, I'm sure, because this does do a pretty cool thing. And then if you, for instance, look at Dire Frenzy with charging minions, say like a Huffer, you suddenly add these scary 7/5 Huffers for 3 mana into your deck that you're going to draw. You're going to basically draw 3 upgraded, cheaper Leroys at some point, which could give you a really powerful win condition. Frankly, you could run 2 Dire Frenzies to shuffle 6 Huffers into your deck, and that gets really scary really fast. That's cool. If you're going for like a long-term value plan, you could also, for instance, shuffle some buffed Zombeasts into your deck. If you find like the perfect Zombies and you play it for 6 mana and you Dire Frenzy it, boom, you've got some awesome Zombies, additional crazy cards built into your deck, and you can go longer in a control style game. So the possibilities are there. I like the potential for this card. It does some neat stuff. It is a bit slow at first. Takes a while for this value to show up, but you're banking a considerable amount of value in the long run. So it's just about finding a hunter deck that supports it. But in a vacuum, I like Dire Frenzy. Will it see play right away? I would guess not. I think somebody would have to figure out a deck, or maybe some other cards come along that really benefit from this. I don't know. A lot of people are talking about Dire Frenzy's interaction with Hunting Mastiff and Echo. So you can cast this on, for instance, a Hunting Mastiff minion that you played, a rushing 2/1 beast. And then it would become, of course, a rushing 5/4 beast, which would be really cool. And it would shuffle that into your deck as well, 3 of those. You would shuffle 3 rushing 5/4 beasts into your deck. But notably, when you would play those again, and they echo themselves. Remember, the echo returns the original minion, not a buffed version of the minion. So there is a somewhat positive interaction with Hunting Mastiff, with Dire Frenzy, but it's not an extra positive reaction. It's just on those first minions, not the resummons from the echo. So you can't chain the value like enormously far with that. It would still be fine, but it wouldn't necessarily be any better than any other card as far as the total upside or total stat value is concerned. So just wanted to note that real quick. But again, at the end of the day, I like this card. It's not amazing. It's not going to see play in every hunter deck by any means. It doesn't fit faster playstyles very well at all. But in the right deck, it sure has a chance. So up next, let's talk about a new rogue weapon. This is the Spectral Cutlass, a new 4-mana 2/2. It has lifesteal, and it says whenever you play a card from another class, gain +1 durability. So here we have another sort of Burgle Rogue support card. I thought we were maybe going to see the end of these. A lot of the Burgle Rogue stuff is either rotating out or wild specific at this point. So maybe they did just design a card like this to find some support in wild, because right now I don't see enough stuff in standard for this one to make a lot of sense. Obviously a 4-mana 2/2 weapon, even with lifesteal, isn't that good. That's just way worse than something like True Silver Champion in Paladin. So you kind of have to get the Burgle aspect for this one to make sense. Yes, I guess if it does become a 2/5, a 2/6, the value starts to add up a lot. And if you could weapon buff it with, whatever weapon buff card you choose, Deadly Poison, for instance, yeah, a 4/4 with lifesteal is pretty solid for 4 mana. That's not bad at all. Now, of course, when you talk about that, the elephant in the room, of course, is Kingsbane. Because, hey, Kingsbane can be like a 15/2 or 15/3 even with lifesteal. And you might say Spectral Cutlass would never ever see play when Kingsbane exists. And that's true to some extent, I think. Clearly, Kingsbane requires a second card, Leeching Poison, in order to enable it. But the potential for Kingsbane is so much higher than something like Spectral Cutlass. It can do so much more and go so much farther and hit so many more times, despite the durability buff here, that in some ways, that's probably true, that if Kingsbane is around, Spectral Cutlass would have to be ignored in favor of Kingsbane for the average rogue deck. In a Burgle Rogue deck specifically, where you don't want to run Kingsbane or don't want to run Leeching Poison, sure, this could work. But that's such a specific limitation and a specific kind of deck. This one just falls in between that gap of your hero power and Kingsbane in such a negative way that I just don't see anybody playing this one. This one looks like it's going to be almost impossible to build a deck around in Standard right now. Even in Wild, I don't know why you'd want to play that deck when better options and better cards exist so far. Maybe someday in like 3 years there will be enough Burgle support to make something like Spectral Cutlass make sense. But in the meantime, I'm a little sad that what looks like kind of a wasted card slot to me, because I don't know who wants to run this or who wants to play this one right now. Now, let me be frank. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they add some cool Burgle stuff. I would love that playstyle to take off. And I'd love Spectral Cutlass to make the cut. But even in a Burgle world, I'm still worried maybe like Obsidian Shard would be better because it's a higher tempo card as opposed to a higher value card. So Spectral Cutlass leaves me with a ton of doubts. I'm just not seeing how this one works. So now finally for our last 3 cards here, we're going to be taking a look at some of the Worgen style cards that swap their attack and health each turn they're in your hand. Up first is the Swift Messenger, a 4-mana 2/6. This one also has Rush. And I'll say right now that basically all three of these next cards feel kind of like arena cards or filler cards or throwaway cards. I don't think many of these have any way to make a cut in a constructed deck. They're just not doing anything powerful enough. A 2/6 with Rush for 4 mana is fine. It can trade into things. It can kill some knife jugglers along the way. It's not a terrible play because you get that instant value, has enough health to hang around to trade again. Not what I would call a particularly strong 4 mana play, but a reasonably okay one. And again, probably decent in Arena. If you swap the stats and it becomes a 6/2, some people might say, well, Regis, that looks a bit like a Fireball. Fireball is a great card. You could use Swift Messenger as a Fireball. Sometimes, yes, you could. You could use this to remove a minion for 4 mana, and that would be okay. Of course, very limited compared to Fireball, of course, because you can't go face with it and you can't go around taunts with it. So not quite as good as Fireball. The other problem with Worgen-style cards in general, I think, which I'm not sure if it was supposed to be an upside or a downside, but to me it feels like a downside, is that when its attack and health keep swapping, it's going to feel like sometimes it's not what you want it to be. Sometimes you want it to be that Fireball, and instead it's like a Flame Geyser. It's only hitting for 2 instead of 6 because it's on the wrong side of the swap. So I think that feels like a big limitation too. It's like, what if you need to kill the Knife Juggler and it's a 6/2? You feel absolutely miserable. That's no fun at all. So this card, I just don't see how it ever works. It's not going to make sense in constructed play. Yes, there are things with like Lady in White, for instance, where sure, it's a 6/6 with Lady in White, but I think there are still better cards to run and better options. I'm not going to judge every card for the forever of future card reviews based on its synergies with Lady in White buffing its attack. I just don't think that's a meaningful measure of a card's potential. There's no way that's enough to make this a good card in my eyes. So ultimately, a bad card. And then up next here we have a pretty similar card. This is the Gilnean Royal Guard, also a Worgen that swaps its stuff. It's also got Rush, but this one has Divine Shield on top of that, and it's an 8 mana 3/8. That is a crazy stat line. I don't know if we've ever seen a stat line quite like that. So at its base level, this is like a bad Alakir. It's a 3 attack minion with Divine Shield that can only attack minions. It can't go face, and it doesn't have Wind Fury. That's not a very favorable comparison. Sure, it has a couple extra health points, but still falls pretty short compared to Alakir, which is pretty much an average card these days. Now, of course, if you swap this and it becomes an 8/3 with Rush and Divine Shield, it's definitely going to be able to take better trades, but then you have a 3 health minion left around, and that's clearly not that exciting. 3 health doesn't live to very much, so it probably dies. It might go 2 for 1, which is okay. Certainly good in Arena. I think, again, pretty solid Arena card, but just not strong enough to make the cut in Constructed as far as I'm concerned. Once again, yes, there is a Lady in White synergy here. Yes, there's some pre-synergy in general because of the high health total. That's always a possibility, but again, I'm not going to judge this card just based on maybe Lady in White being a good thing and making it work. Because frankly, even as an 8/8 Rush with Divine Shield, that's really good, but still probably not great. Still not like the best play you're going to make that game. So I don't think even that, since it's so slow at 8 mana, is going to be significant. Not to mention, of course, you could draw this well before your Lady in White, and then you've got a pretty bad card. So a lot of risk built into Gilnean Royal Guard, even in that context. So, yeah, it can do some sneaky things from time to time with certain decks that are swapping stats. Like, yes, there's the potential there, but it's not going to be a combo enabler to hit face because it only has Rush, not Charge. And because of the swap being awkward, again, it's going to create some friction in your hand. You don't know when it's going to be good or when it's going to be bad, and it might be bad when you need it to be good. And that is always a problem. So, again, just a card that looks a bit like filler to me. It's cool. It mixes a lot of keywords together. I like it. It's neat. I want to play it in Arena, but I don't want to play it in Constructed. And then finally here I have one last card, the Spellshifter. This is another Worgen. Instead of Rush, this guy has spell damage +1, and he's a 2 mana 1/4. So sometimes he's a 1/4, and sometimes he's a 4/1. And I will say right now, you probably don't ever want to play this card as a 4/1 just like into the board, because clearly 1 health dies to everything. That's not very favorable. As a 1/4 playing him into the board, he can trade into some tokens here and there. There's some potential for that. Spell damage as a keyword is not something we've seen supported all that well in Hearthstone's past. It's usually only used in like Freeze Mage burst decks. There have been cards like Azure Drake that use it, but not really because of the spell damage, right? It was always sort of a nice little bonus, but not the reason it was played. Blood Mage Thanos, another card that gets run for spell damage sometimes, but spell damage, again, is kind of the bonus, not really the reason it's played. It's a small part of it. Spellshifter, if you're playing it, the only reason you're going to play it is for the spell damage. And I'm not sure it's worth it. Like, is it better than Kobold Geomancer? Sure, it's a little better. It has 5 stats instead of 4. So there's some upside there. Yeah, the potential exists, but if you're just running like a cheap spell damage minion, you're probably going to run Blood Mage Thanos in like a Burst Freeze Mage deck, for instance. If you're trying to run something that trades into the board on turn 2, Spellshifter's not it. If you have like a turn 3 AoE card exactly that you need to empower with spell damage sometimes, and the meta lines up perfectly, maybe once in a blue moon, Spellshifter somehow makes the cut in a constructed deck. It's not absolutely impossible, but I think it's really, really, really unlikely. I think better cards exist for both spell damage and early on-board plays, so I don't see Spellshifter once again making the cut. And yet again, the Worgen aspect is a pretty big downside. If it's a 4-1 on turn 2, you feel absolutely terrible, so this card looks like it's going to fall short too. And there you go, guys. Those were my detailed reviews. That was a lot of cards to talk through. I'm losing my voice already. So let's go ahead and jump into my quick reviews next. Dollmaster Dorian is a 3-star card. Blood Witch is a 2-star card. Dusk Bat is a 3-star card. Deathweb Spider is a 2-star card. Bog Shaper is a 3-star card. Dire Frenzy is a 3-star card. Spectral Cutlass is a 1-star card. Swift Messenger is a 1-star card. Gilnean Royal Guard is a 2-star card. Spellshifter is a 1-star card. And that's it. Part 12 of the Witchwood card review is done. I have to say, not the most impressive set of cards. I think a couple of those were probably fillers. The Warlock package of self-damage didn't really seem all that convincing to me. Dorian is intriguing. Bogshaper was intriguing. There were some possibilities there, but nothing that stood out to me as a super consistent, strong, awesome card. But I'm curious, did you guys think I missed something? Was there an awesome card there that I didn't quite see? Was there a 5-star card lurking in the Witchwood somewhere? Let me know in the comments below. I always love to hear your thoughts. You guys have a lot of great insights. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.